Most established teams at the 2026 World Cup carried something heavy. A history. A weight of expectation. A ghost of the last time they were there. Brazil was haunted by 5 stars they felt they had to defend. Germany was chasing the machine they used to be. England was dragging 6 decades without another World Cup behind them like a chain. The traditional powers at this tournament were measured against their own past. And then there was Norway. Because Norway didn't come to this World Cup to live up to a legacy. Norway came because, for an entire generation, there was almost no World Cup legacy to live up to at all. And that one difference changed absolutely everything about how they played, why they were dangerous, and why they pushed further than any Norwegian team had ever gone before. They did not win the World Cup. Their journey ended against England in a brutal quarterfinal that required extra time to separate them. But that defeat did not expose Norway's story as an illusion. It proved just how real it had become. Stick with me, because by the end of this, you're going to understand why Norway's greatest World Cup ended in defeat, yet still changed the way the rest of the world sees them. And the last reason on this list is the one nobody in world football saw coming. Here's the thing you have to understand first. When most traditional football nations qualify for a World Cup, it's a continuation. It's chapter 24 of a story the country has been telling for 100 years. But for Norway, the 2026 World Cup wasn't a continuation. It was a resurrection. This was a nation that had last appeared at a World Cup in 1998. 1998. Think about what that actually means. A 28-year absence. An entire generation of younger Norwegians grew up, went to school, got jobs, and had children of their own without ever once watching their national team walk out at a World Cup. Many of the players carrying Norway were children, newborns, or not even born the last time this happened. And that's not a small detail. That's the whole story, because it meant Norway arrived with no recent World Cup scar tissue, no modern World Cup trauma, no crushing weight of "we have to." The traditional giants were trying to protect something. Norway was trying to discover something, and a team that is discovering can be far more dangerous than a team that is defending. Now, before the tournament, I know what you might have been thinking. Plenty of small nations qualify, get knocked out early, and go home. What made Norway different? Why should this specific team, out of all the underdogs in football history, have been the one you actually watched? The answer is that Norway did not simply arrive, enjoy the occasion, and disappear. They survived the group stage. They defeated Ivory Coast in the round of 32. Then they faced Brazil, the 5-time world champions, and beat them 2-1. Norway did not stumble into the knockout rounds and wait for reality to catch up with them. They kept advancing until only 8 teams remained. For the first time in their history, Norway had reached a World Cup quarterfinal. And the more you look at how Norway got there, the more you realize this wasn't a lucky team that stumbled into a tournament. This was a team that had already done something not even most European heavyweights managed to do before the World Cup had begun. And it started with a statistic so absurd that when I first read it, I assumed it was a typo. Let me set the scene. In world football, qualifying campaigns are grinding, ugly, exhausting marathons. You drop points on frozen pitches in October. You draw 0-0 away to teams you've never heard of. Even the giants stumble. Even the best sides in Europe lose a match somewhere along the way. That's just the nature of it. Everybody assumes that to reach a World Cup, you have to survive a campaign full of scars. And that assumption is exactly why what Norway did feels impossible. Because Norway didn't survive their qualifying campaign. They obliterated it. 8 matches played in UEFA Group 1. 8 wins. 0 draws. 0 losses. A perfect record. 37 goals scored, only 5 conceded. Not a single dropped point across the entire campaign. In a sport engineered to humble you, in a group designed to trip you up, Norway walked through the whole thing without stumbling once. And here's the part that matters. The team many people still thought of as plucky little Norway, the nation that hadn't played at a World Cup in 28 years, and had not appeared at a major finals since Euro 2000. Put together one of the most dominant qualifying runs of any team on the entire continent. That's the first thing that made them the opposite. Many expected them to fight for qualification. Almost nobody expected them to be flawless. But a perfect record on its own doesn't tell you why. It tells you what happened, not how. And the how is where this gets genuinely fascinating, because it comes down to one man who represented the single biggest inversion of all. Think about how superstars usually arrive at World Cups. Messi carried the weight of Argentina for 4 straight tournaments before he finally lifted the trophy. Ronaldo went to 5 World Cups. Mbappé won 1 and reached another final before he was 25. The pattern is always the same. The generational talent shows up early, suffers through years of near misses, and slowly, painfully learns how to win on the biggest stage. That's the script. That's how it's supposed to go. And then there was Erling Haaland, a man who has scored goals at one of the most terrifying rates the modern game has ever seen. A striker so relentless that defenders talk about facing him the way people talk about surviving a natural disaster. And here is the fact that flipped the entire narrative. The 2026 World Cup was the first major international tournament of his entire career. Read that again. One of the most feared goal scorers on the planet, a player who has broken records that stood for decades, was playing in his first ever World Cup. While many of the established superstars arrived worn down by tournament heartbreak, Norway's superstar arrived completely fresh, completely unburdened, and absolutely starving. 16 goals in qualifying. 16. He didn't just help Norway qualify. He became the face of an entire nation returning from a 28-year World Cup exile, backed by the strongest Norwegian generation in decades. And then, the tournament answered the question everybody had been asking. What happens when one of the most dangerous strikers alive finally gets the one stage he's never been allowed to stand on? Norway goes further than it has ever gone before. Haaland and his teammates did not lift the trophy, and England ultimately found a way to stop them. But Norway's run proved that their qualifying campaign was not a statistical accident. The hunger was real. The danger was real. And by the time they walked into that quarterfinal in Miami, nobody was treating them like a romantic little underdog anymore. But if I stopped there, I'd be doing this story a disservice, because the easy version is Norway has Haaland, Haaland scores goals. The end. That's the surface. That's what everyone else will tell you. The deeper truth, the thing that actually made this team the opposite of the traditional powers, was psychological. And to understand it, you have to understand what a World Cup does to the human mind. For most great football nations, the tournament is drenched in fear. The fear of embarrassment. The fear of letting down 100 years of history. Brazilian players have described the crushing pressure of representing 5 World Cup titles. English players have spoken about the anxiety of a nation that expects and is never satisfied. That pressure is real, and it's paralyzing. And you can see it in the way favorites tighten up in knockout games, in the way legs turn to stone in penalty shootouts. Expectation, it turns out, is a weight. And now flip it. Norway had a different kind of pressure. They carried the memory of decades of failed qualification campaigns, but they did not carry the recent World Cup burden of a nation expected to win everything. There was no Norwegian generation demanding a trophy, because for most younger Norwegian fans, this was the first World Cup they could truly remember. There was no unbearable modern World Cup history to protect, because the World Cup story paused after 1998 and simply went quiet. When Norway stepped onto the pitch, they weren't trying to avoid failure in the same way the Giants were. They were free, and a free team plays differently. A free team takes the shot instead of passing sideways. A free team runs at defenders instead of protecting a reputation. That freedom carried Norway through 2 knockout rounds and into the last 8. It carried them past Brazil. And against England, it carried them into the lead. Andreas Schjelderup scored first, and for a moment, Norway stood within touching distance of a World Cup semi-final. Think about that. A country that had not even qualified for the tournament in 28 years was leading England in the quarterfinal of its first World Cup back. But freedom does not make you invincible. It does not guarantee that every final pass reaches its target or that every narrow decision falls your way. Jude Bellingham equalized before halftime. Norway kept fighting. They pushed the game beyond 90 minutes, refusing to allow England's deeper tournament experience, larger reputation, or greater expectations to decide the match for them. It required extra time. It required another Bellingham goal. And only then, after Norway had forced one of the traditional giants to the absolute edge, did their run finally end in a 2-1 defeat. This was the psychology every underdog dreams of, and almost none of them actually possess, because most underdogs are terrified of the moment. Norway wasn't terrified of the moment. Norway waited 28 years for the moment, and when it finally arrived, they did not hide from it. They attacked it until there were only 8 teams left in the world, and even England needed extra time to make them disappear. That's the inversion nobody talks about, and it might be the most important one of all. Now here's where it gets even stranger, because before the tournament, you would have assumed that a nation returning after 28 years would be fragile, untested, a group of players who had never felt the heat of a real World Cup and would melt the moment the pressure arrived. That was the logical expectation. A team that hadn't been to a World Cup in a generation should, by every reasonable measure, have been exactly the kind of team that folded under the lights. And yet everything about how Norway qualified said the opposite. This was not a fragile team. A fragile team does not win 8 out of 8. A fragile team does not concede only 5 goals across an entire campaign. A fragile team does not go a full qualifying run without dropping a single point. And now we know that a fragile team does not return after 28 years. Survive the group stage, beat Ivory Coast, eliminate Brazil, reach its first World Cup quarterfinal, take the lead against England, and force the match into extra time. Norway's inexperience at World Cups was real, but their supposed weakness, the idea that they would crack under pressure, was contradicted by almost everything they did. They qualified perfectly, in a sport that almost never allows perfection. Then they produced the deepest World Cup run in Norwegian history. Yes, they eventually broke. Every team except one eventually does. But Norway did not collapse beneath the occasion. They were beaten by a team that found 2 decisive moments in a match separated by the smallest margins. There is a difference, and that difference matters, because the question is no longer, can this inexperienced team handle the pressure? Norway already answered that. The more unsettling question for their future opponents is what happens next, now that the inexperience is gone. What happens when a team with this talent, this hunger, and this freedom returns carrying the memory not of humiliation, but of how close it came? And that's the full picture. Look at what we've assembled here. The traditional powers at the 2026 World Cup were defined by their past, and Norway was defined by its long absence from the stage. The giants feared failure, and Norway had been freed from that particular fear by 28 years in the wilderness. Most established superstars arrived carrying tournament heartbreak, and Norway's superstar arrived having never tasted it. 16 qualifying goals deep and desperate for more. Most underdog stories are built around survival, and Norway marched through qualifying perfectly, then kept marching until England stopped them 1 match short of the semifinals. It's not one thing, it's everything at once. Point by point, at every single place where you'd expect this team to line up with the rest of the field, they lined up as the exact opposite. That's not an accident. That's an identity. And the beautiful, chaotic truth of a World Cup is that identity matters more than reputation. The teams that go far are not always the ones carrying the most history. Sometimes they are the ones playing with the most freedom. In 2018, it was Croatia, a tiny nation that reached a final nobody predicted. Again and again, the tournament finds room for the team that plays like it has nothing to lose. And in 2026, Norway became that team. They did not complete the fairy tale. England ended it. But the ending does not erase the journey. In some ways, it makes the journey more meaningful, because Norway's story was never supposed to be about effortless destiny. It was about what could happen when an entire football nation finally returned to the stage without being chained to everything that had happened there before. They arrived without a modern World Cup legacy. They left with one. So here's what I want you to actually take away from all of this. When this World Cup began, everyone around you was watching the giants. They were watching Brazil and France and Argentina, waiting for the usual suspects to do the usual things. Norway forced them to watch something different. A nation that had waited an entire generation for this, led by a striker finally standing on a stage this big, playing with a freedom that money and history couldn't buy. They defeated Brazil. They reached the quarterfinals. They stood level with England after 90 minutes and came close enough to the semifinals to understand exactly what that stage feels like. And when England finally beat them 2-1 after extra time, Norway did not leave the tournament as the same country that entered it. They came in searching for a World Cup identity. They went home with the best World Cup run in their history. They came in as the nation with almost no recent legacy to protect. They went home having created a legacy the next generation will be expected to follow. That is the final inversion. Norway's greatest strength was that they carried almost none of the old World Cup weight. But because of what they achieved in 2026, the next Norwegian team will carry something this one never had: expectations. The freedom that made them dangerous has now created the pressure that comes with being taken seriously. For the first time in decades, Norway will not return to international football merely hoping to qualify. The world has seen what they can do. Their supporters have seen how far they can go. And Norway itself has seen how close the impossible really is. Because now they know. They know what it feels like to eliminate Brazil. They know what it feels like to play in a World Cup quarterfinal. They know what it feels like to lead England, to push them into extra time, and to stand one goal away from the Final Four. That knowledge cannot be taken away by the final score. Norway wasn't the opposite of the traditional powers at this World Cup by accident. They were the opposite by design. And although England ended their tournament, they also ended something else. Norway's ability to call itself an inexperienced outsider with nothing to lose. That version of Norway is gone now. In its place is a country with proof, memories, expectations, and unfinished business. Now, if this changed the way you see Norway after this World Cup, then there's one more thing you absolutely need to understand as the tournament reaches its decisive stages. And it's the exact opposite of everything we just talked about. Because if Norway entered this competition as the team with nothing to lose, then England is a nation carrying more pressure than almost any team in the history of the sport. And after surviving Norway in extra time, that weight has only become heavier. I break the whole thing down in the video on the screen right now, so go watch that one next. But before you do, if you enjoy this kind of deep dive, do me one quick favor and hit that subscribe button. Subscribe now, and I'll see you in the next one.